Randy Foye, an NBA player who spent his entire career with his heart on the right side of his chest and his liver on the left. It sounds like a medical glitch, but it was real. And it's exactly the kind of story that reminds you the NBA was never just highlights, championships, and superstar mythology. Behind all of that, there are cases that sound medically impossible, flights that nearly wiped out entire teams, moments of violence that went way past competition, and players whose lives got warped by the system around them. Some of these stories are too strange, some are too dark, and some are the kind of stories normal sports media barely wants to touch because once you look too closely, it stops feeling like sports content and starts feeling like an NBA case file. Randy Foye should have sounded like a medical outlier before he ever sounded like an NBA player. He lived with situs inversus totalis, a condition where the body's major internal organs are reversed like a mirror image. His heart sat on the right side. His liver sat on the left. His internal layout looked like someone flipped the blueprint of a human body, and somehow everything still kept working. What makes it stranger is that Foye didn't even know until he was 9 years old when a case of pneumonia sent him to the hospital. Imaging revealed that his body wasn't organized the way medicine expects a body to be organized. For most people, hearing that would instantly sound like a limit, a warning, maybe even a life sentence of physical caution. But in Foye's case, the strangest part was that it barely stopped him from doing anything. He still ran, still competed, still made it to the NBA, still built a real professional career. And that's what turns the story from unusual into unforgettable. Because this is not one of those tragic stories where fate crushes talent before it fully arrives. This is a man whose body was so rare it almost feels fictional, and he still survived in the most demanding basketball league on earth. In a league built on elite bodies, Randy Foye may have had one of the rarest bodies the NBA has ever seen. But if Randy Foye's story makes the NBA feel biologically surreal, the 1960 Minneapolis Lakers flight pushes things into something much darker, the kind of night where an entire team almost disappeared from basketball history in a single trip home. On January 17, 1960, after a game against the St. Louis Hawks, the Lakers took off for Minneapolis aboard a Douglas DC-3, a converted World War II cargo plane. That already sounds uneasy. Then roughly 10 minutes into the flight, the nightmare started stacking up. The heater lost power. The radio went dead. The lights went out. The fuel gauge stopped helping. The compass became unreliable. One by one, almost every system you would want during a winter night flight began to fail. And outside, it was not calm sky. It was a full whiteout blizzard. Visibility was basically gone. The pilots could not communicate properly, could not navigate cleanly, and could not safely turn back. So they did the only thing left to do. They kept flying through darkness and freezing air with fuel dropping lower and lower, hoping they would spot anything below before time ran out. After nearly 4 hours of blind flying, they finally found the area near Carroll, Iowa, and made the decision to land in a cornfield in the dark. The landing happened with 23 people on board. Every single one of them survived. And that is what makes this story so unsettling. History usually remembers what happened, but sometimes the darkest part is what almost happened. That night, the NBA did not almost lose a game. It almost lost an entire team. Stories like that can make you think the darkest parts of NBA history live in accidents, near-death moments, or facts so rare they almost feel unreal. But sometimes the heaviest darkness does not arrive in one dramatic night. Sometimes it comes slowly, quietly, and far more cruelly. Brian Grant learned that the hard way. After finishing his NBA career in 2006, he stepped into a fight that had nothing to do with rebounding physicality or competitive endurance anymore. Just 2 years later, at age 36, Grant was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's disease. But it did not arrive like a lightning strike. It had already been creeping in. A tremor in his left hand. Less lift in his left leg. Small changes that could easily be dismissed as stress fatigue or just the normal damage left behind by years in the league. Then the truth settled in. This was not ordinary wear and tear. This was something that would not leave. Something that could not be beaten with effort alone. And that is what made it so brutal. The diagnosis was one thing. Realizing that some opponents in life do not care how tough you used to be was something else entirely. Some battles do not reward grit. Some do not respect willpower. Some do not let you fight your way back with one more push. Years later, the NBA saw a different kind of darkness in Tyrell Terry. Not a veteran at the end of the road, but a young player just entering the dream. Terry was the 31st pick in the 2020 draft. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of a promising career. Inside, everything was collapsing fast. By late 2022, at just 22 years old, he retired. Not because he had no ability left, but because basketball, in his own words, had become something that was destroying him instead of building him. He described waking up nauseous, struggling to breathe, and living under constant weight and anxiety. This was not a bad stretch of games, not a slump. It was a deeper breakdown. Brian Grant showed what it looks like when the body turns against a player after the career ends. Tyrell Terry showed what it looks like when the mind starts breaking before the career even truly begins. And that may be the darkest part of all. Basketball does not always destroy people in one moment. Sometimes it does it slowly. And then there are the moments when darkness in the NBA does not come from illness or circumstance. It comes from people in the exact second they let anger run past every limit. It is no longer hard competition, no longer playoff intensity. It becomes something dirtier, more dangerous, and almost impossible to defend. One of the clearest examples was Andrew Bynum's elbow on J.J. Barea in the 2011 playoffs. The Lakers were already getting destroyed by Dallas. The game was basically over in every emotional sense, and right in the middle of that humiliation, Bynum stepped into what should have been a routine drive and slammed his elbow into Barea's body while Barea was in the air. There was no serious play on the ball. Nothing about it looked like legitimate defense. It was pure frustration fired at a much smaller player who had no real way to protect himself. That moment was instantly remembered as one of the dirtiest plays of that playoff run. Not just because of the contact, but because it felt like total loss of control. The Lakers had lost control of the game, and for at least one moment, Binham lost control of himself too. But if that was open violence, Reggie Evans' act against Chris Kaman in 2006 was the kind of ugliness that made people freeze in disbelief. During a rebound battle, Evans reached inside Kaman's shorts and grabbed his groin. Not a jersey pull, not ambiguous contact. The cameras caught it, the crowd saw it, and the whole thing immediately moved beyond the normal language of basketball. It was not just a dirty play anymore. It became one of the strangest, most invasive, and most uncomfortable moments the league had ever seen. Two very different incidents, same ugly truth. Under enough pressure, bitterness, or impulse, a basketball game can stop looking like sports in a single second. But maybe the most disturbing thing about the NBA's darker stories is this. Sometimes the problem is not one angry player, one violent moment, or one cursed night. Sometimes the system itself is what ruins people before they ever get a fair start. Connie Hawkins is one of the cruelest examples. As a freshman at Iowa in the early 1960s, he got pulled into a point-shaving scandal. He was never convicted, never proven guilty, and it still did not save him. Hawkins was pushed out and then effectively blackballed from the NBA. Year after year, teams stayed away from him even though the talent was obvious. He had to keep playing elsewhere, dominating other leagues, proving over and over that he belonged at the highest level. Only after a major legal fight did the NBA finally settle and let him in. And when the chance finally came, Hawkins immediately proved how absurd those lost years had been. That story is not just about injustice. It is about a league being able to erase a player's prime through suspicion, silence, and unchecked power. Giannis Antetokounmpo represents a different kind of cruelty. Before the MVPs, before the superstardom, before he became the face of a franchise, he was trapped in a legal gray zone where he was not fully recognized by any country. He was born in Athens and raised in Athens, but Greek citizenship law was based on descent, not birthplace. So Giannis was not automatically considered Greek. Nigeria had not issued him papers either. In real terms, one of the NBA's future greats was living without a passport, without the freedom to travel for workouts, meetings, or draft preparation. One more delay in paperwork and his path to the NBA could have been warped before it even began. It sounds bureaucratic, but that is exactly what makes it so unsettling. Sometimes a future superstar is not blocked by competition. Sometimes he is blocked by a stamp. Then there was the Vancouver Grizzlies, an expansion franchise that entered the NBA in 1995 and was basically handcuffed from day one. They were not allowed the same access to the top of the lottery that other struggling teams could hope for. They were blocked from getting the #1 pick in their early years. They were also restricted financially and could not spend up to the full salary cap the way other teams could. In other words, the NBA let them in, then made team building harder for them than it was for everyone else. The result is familiar: losing frustration, no momentum, and eventually relocation. That story often gets told like a failed expansion experiment. Look closer, and it feels more like a lesson in how a system can design failure and then let someone else carry the blame. And of course, not every dark NBA story leaves behind blood medical records or a courtroom trail. Some survive in a different way. They cling to reputation, ego power, and the quiet realization that a legacy can be distorted simply because the people in control refuse to let go. David Stern's clash with Jim Rome is a perfect example. When Rome asked whether the lottery had been fixed, Stern did not just deny it. He fired back with the now infamous line, "Have you stopped beating your wife yet?" That was no longer an answer. It was a verbal trap built to embarrass Corner and dominate the interview. The moment lasted because it was shocking, but also because it exposed something colder underneath. Power in the NBA did not always need to be polite to defend itself. Sometimes it just needed enough confidence to turn a question into a public show of force. Kevin Garnett represents another version of that darkness. Not scandal-driven darkness, but the kind that grows from a relationship that never healed between a legend and the franchise he helped define. Garnett's number 21 still has not gone up in Minnesota, not because he failed to earn it, but because he refused to let the organization honor him while Glenn Taylor remained in control. That is the kind of fracture that freezes a legacy not because of performance, but because trust died first. One of the most important figures in Timberwolves history is still standing outside the ceremony that should have happened years ago, because for him, principle outweighed recognition. Then there is Jermaine ONeal. No grand tribute, no final statement, just the feeling of being quietly faded out. When number 7 was handed to someone else in Indiana, O'Neal's reaction did not feel petty. It felt personal. He had been the face of that franchise for years. An all-star, an anchor, a player who helped shape an entire era of Pacers basketball. But his history has always been dragged behind the shadow of malice at the Palace. And sometimes in sports, one stain becomes large enough to keep the rest of a legacy suspended forever. That is a different kind of darkness, less explosive than violence, but far more durable. The darkness of power deciding how people will be remembered. That may be why stories like these last longer than highlights ever do. They were never built to become beautiful moments. They do not turn into posters, tribute, montages, or polished pieces of league mythology. They stay where they are buried in NBA history. Like darker folds, the sport can never fully smooth out. A player with mirrored organs surviving an entire professional career. A team that almost vanished in a blizzard. Bodies and minds turning against the very people who once lived through strength. Moments of violence that crossed far beyond competition. Legends trapped in power struggles with the franchises they helped build. And talents, even entire organizations, getting bent out of shape by the system before they were ever given a fair chance. That is why these stories are not just too dark for normal media. They remind you that behind the polished version of the NBA, the world is used to seeing there has always been another version. Stranger, heavier, and sometimes much more frightening.